Acid Horizon rounds out another spooky October with an episode on Kant's last words. Before we begin, please click subscribe wherever you are listening. Also, if you have a moment, please review us on any of the platforms on which you listen, or share one of your favorite episodes on social media. That really helps us out. Also, you probably want to check out some of the monthly seminars we have been conducting on our Patreon account. We bring in scholars and friends in a sort of interactive symposium where you can ask questions and venture your own ideas. If you have been enjoying Acid Horizon over the past year, it only costs $2 to support us for the rest of the year. And what's exciting is that at the end of this year and into 2022, we will be developing a new video channel in association with the podcast. In the meantime, check out our blogs, check out our merch store, and check out any of the links that we have in any one of our episodes to get access to more content. Okay, let's begin. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Craig, that's me, and Adam is here to speak with someone who will soon be Dr. Terry D. Thomson to discuss his work on Kant's final, most esoteric, and most understudied philosophical work, his chief achievement, as he called it, the Opus Postumum. This text is Kant's attempt to radicalize his own philosophical process, rending the project of his three critiques from their ossifications as dogmas and opening a new space for the philosophy of experience on the ontological, anthropological, and cosmological level in the promise of an absolute system of ethereal forces. Terry joins us fresh from completing his doctoral thesis on the Opus Postumum, and using the work of Kant scholar Howard Caygill as a base. Together, we're going to be pushing to the very limits of transcendental idealism in pursuit of the cosmic force of human experience. Terry, welcome to Acid Horizon.
Hi, how's it going?
It's great to have you with us. One of the things that we're going to want to do today is we're going to do a deep dive on Kant's last words, as we've called this episode, but also unpack some of the familiar concepts to Kantian scholars that, we can present to people who maybe aren't so familiar with Kant. But since you are friends with Adam here, I'm going to let Adam kind of take the lead in this interview. And thank you, Adam, for bringing Terry. So maybe you can kick things off for us.
Absolutely. I mean, this is on day of recording. This is our me and Terry's third session of Kant or Kant adjacent philosophy today. So we've gone through a lot of Kantism together. And I guess the place to start with is, most basic terms, what is the Opus Postumum? What sort of place does it take in Kant's work? How is it composed? Where does it come from in the sense? Because it's not a typical sense of a textbook or a lecture or even an article, or even a journal article in those various secret societies he liked writing for in Berlin. It's quite an esoteric piece. It's something that it's only really been assembled. It is itself an assemblage. So I guess, where does it come from? How is it structured? And why is it so slept on in Kant scholarship?
It's really, really good questions. These are questions that I still sort of try to tackle now after all of years of kind of working with it. But I mean, at its most basic, Opus Postumum is basically it's a sort of collection of drafts, marginalia, notes that Kant left on his desk when he died. So it's composed of 12 fascicles. So it's like bundles of sort of sheets, papers that he was working on. They were composed from about 1796 until 1803. So a year before he died. And, they deal with a lot of different things, a lot of different sort of subjects in his back catalogue, One of the kind of most striking aspects of it is that he was working on a new work that he entitled Transition from a Metaphysical Foundations to Physics. And that sort of takes up quite a lot of the project that he's trying to kind of erect in Opus Postumum. So he sort of tries to think through transition in that way. And maybe we can go into some of the details about it, but it's a very fragmentary sort of text. I mean, even calling it a text is probably not correct, because it's not really a text. It's a sort of collection. So
What do we mean by the term transition here with respect to Kant?
well, Kant thinks of it as a transition between a priori principles or knowledge to empirical knowledge. So how do you go from having, these sort of concepts that precede experience to experience itself? And so he terms it as metaphysical foundations on the a priori side and physics on the empirical side. So that's the sort of basic starting point that Kant tries to think, but it becomes a sort of descent into thinking transition itself, and how to think transition and how to think transitionally. It's a really important concept. It bubbles under the surface of a lot of Kant's previous work, transition. It sort of most notably comes to the surface in the Schematism first critique, which was sort of designed to link up the intuition and the concept. And then it gets kind of more explicitly theorized here in Opus Postumum. So it really bubbles to the surface as a concept. In many ways, Opus Postumum becomes a sort of reflection on what transition is. What is it as a concept, and what is it as a method?
The schematism is great to bring up on that. So just to sort of clarify, the schematism is essentially what links our senses of things, and our concepts, because our concepts for Kant come from sort of two different sources, two different faculties. He doesn't say mind or body, actually. He says the word Gemut, which is kind of like a corporeal awareness.
Yeah.
There are no minds, nor are there bodies in Kant, unless Kant is talking about physics, in which case there are indeed bodies. But the schematism for Kant is kind of like a way of making concepts make sense by bringing them under the very forms, the very conditions of sensibility, which are him making them refer to space and time, or to have sense in relation to space and time. All it does is it's a transition between having these two completely alien, ultimately, faculties that work towards the same thing, but in different directions, and giving them a bridge together. And I guess one of the fundamental parts of this transition aspect is the transition between, it is linked to this project of linking these three faculties: sense, thinking, and it's particularly for Kant, the understanding is the thinking that does predications. X is Y. X is Y is the structure of judgment. And the understanding functions as a way to give rules to how we formulate judgments, how we can say anything is X or Y that makes any sense. But there's that third faculty of reason, which uses judgment, uses logical structures to it, not only to secure knowledge and so what we basically know, but to extend it beyond that. And that transition, and it seems like, at least in the paper we read from Howard, it's the transition between not simply understanding and sense, but also to how we get to reason, how reason links to all of these, how it can interact with them all, seems to be the key problem that motivates Kant to go beyond the critiques. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how reason functions in the Opus Postumum, and what made him want to go further than what he's already done with reason. Because he's already limited reason, but this limit might not be enough to give it the linkage it needs.
Howard Caygill kind of reads it as there's a sort of transition in terms of how you get from one faculty to another. And reason sort of ends up being primordial in a way. It sort of becomes the root rather than sensibility. And I think there are a few different reasons why Kant would go in that direction. I think one of them is because of his need to set forces into a more, to bring them to the fore, more than he did in Metaphysical Foundations. So Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science that he wrote in 1786, they sort of elaborate upon a concept of body, doctrine of body. And he analyzes it through matter, and force sort of arises in one of those chapters, which is called dynamics. So that's a sort of a doctrine of body, whereas here this is to do with more of a doctrine of force. I mean, all of the faculties for Kant start to become these sort of forces. He starts to think them as force, as in motion. And I mean, there are many reasons. I mean, so there's that one. There's and trying to solve that problem in Metaphysical Foundations. But then you've also got other sort of influences, like, there's a sort of move towards post-Kantianism, in Opus Postumum, in one of the fascicles, called Fascicle 7, where Kant starts to talk about self-positing. So he's taking up this term from sort of the post-Kantian landscape, the 1800s, sort of late 1790s, 1800, and he starts to describe self-consciousness as an act where the I sort of posits itself as an object. And so with that move, you sort of already get the need to rethink how the critical work sort of operates with the self-consciousness. So a lot of it is to do with that, to be honest.
As I understand it, Terry, you are a reader of Deleuze. You've done some work on Deleuze, and just looking at some of the developments in Kant's thinking leads me almost immediately to the work of Deleuze, especially in a place like Difference and Repetition in chapter 3, where he talks about that, where Deleuze develops his own notion of faculties, especially at a time in philosophy where such a move seemed almost unheard of.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that Deleuze develops his own concept of faculties is through this notion of discordant harmonies, right? That there's a kind of violence that allows these transitions between faculties to occur. To what extent do you think that Deleuze's notion of faculties borrows directly from this work here, or is Kant doing something a little bit different? I mean, the whole idea of a theory of forces, there's a connection with Deleuze and Nietzsche and everything that's happening there. Where are the sort of lines of connection between those works?
Yeah, it's a really good point to bring up Deleuze. I mean, you guys know Deleuze way more than I ever will, I think. So I mean, I was kind of hope that you guys can help me out with tracing out those sort of lines. But definitely there is a sort of connection that can be made there. And I think one of the reasons why it hasn't is because of the kind of lack of scholarship that has been done on Opus Postumum. I think I feel like if there were more, then these connections would have been made a little bit more apparent, and perhaps that lineage that sort of goes from Kant would be read maybe a little bit differently when it comes to 20th century continental thought like Deleuze. There are kind of points in Opus Postumum where you can't help but note the Deleuzian sort of atmosphere of it, really. I mean, even in thinking transition, to think transitionally, you can relate that up to sort of flux and flow, and how that sort of operates with difference of degree, and I think that sort of is a good way into how this might connect with Deleuze. There's actually one paper that was written on it by a really great scholar called Beth Lord. She wrote a paper on Opus Postumum and the virtual, and that's a really interesting connection. But again, this is just one paper, But yeah, there are definitely. I mean, another aspect of it is the quantum theory sort of. He sort of, there are some readers of Opus Postumum who claim that he gets close to a sort of proto-quantum theory view, because he's really talking about fields of force, with the ether. It becomes about a field, and you can sort of see how that might feed into something like Deleuze, or someone like Deleuze.
Well, let's get into that notion of forces a bit. So one of the things I like about Howard's paper is how it links up to the faculty. So he does at one point sort of explain that in this book, it seems like there are two kinds of forces for Deleuze, for Kant. There are two kinds of forces for Kant. Two of them, dynamical, two forces. And it's attraction and repulsion. And attractiveness as a force seems to correlate to receptivity, sensation. The senses, in a sense, attract things, and repulsive forces corresponds to the main sort of mode of action that happens in thought and as well in reason, which is spontaneity. And it's also with repulsion. People think of repulsion as a negative force in a way, but maybe in some ways it is, but it is also a sort of propelling away from itself. If a force is fundamentally going outwards, it's being repelled from the point at which it was previously at. And that is the force expressing that repulsion. In a sense, repulsion is propulsion, I guess, if you want to positivize it in that Deleuzian sense. And attractiveness is what pulls things together and could pull things into the reception of each other. And I want to sort of ask how these forces particularly interact for Kant, particularly in thinking about, because this book is partially, at least the first 2/3 of our response to Newton. And he wants to construct a system of forces. And I want to ask how that relates, how these forces sort of interact with each other, what sort of system sort of comes out of this.
Yeah.
But also how they relate to the object. Because if the object is now not a static thing that we just have from this alien force that we get objects from somewhere in itself, we can't quite know it, but we know that we get them. If these objects are now sort of in a way forced upon us, and we could describe force, does this take us beyond the critical limits and into a kind of in itself?
Well, it sort of details an ontology, really, an ontology of forces, which of course is, that's a sort of limitation of the first critique, that it doesn't really set out an ontology. It sort of limits what it's doing to an epistemology. So that would be the major sort of change on that front, I think. He sort of unifies forces, really. So he has this attractive and repulsive force. He wants to think them in a more specific way, as having these specific determinations that can be investigated in an empirical kind of physics setting. So he thinks of things like cohesion, gravity, elasticity, expansion, and then he sort of unifies them into what he calls a Spannkraft, which is the German for, it's like tensional force or tension force. So he views the way that the forces interact with each other are sort of through this tension. They all hold each other in this sort of tensional network, really. And that underpins what the ether is as a sort of this oscillating sort of thing, But again, even calling it a thing is not really. It's a sort of intermediary for Kant, that it's not really matter. It's not really concept. It's sort of intermediate between them, and the oscillation it can be seen as between that.
Because I know Kant uses two words for this kind of this field itself. I'd like to ask if you call it absolute, honestly, but this universal field. Sometimes he seems to call it ether, and sometimes he calls it caloric. And if you could elaborate just a bit more, this is probably the big thing of this text that really takes it out there.
Yeah, ether and caloric are sort of the central pieces, really, of this, and they also sort of indicate, a way out, really, of the critique of pure reason. Even though some people say that it's not. Some people say that it is a sort of rethinking through of substance as it appeared in the first critique. So some people read it in conformity with it. So again, this is one of the problems with working with something like this, that there are sort of many different ways of going about whether this conforms or doesn't conform to the critical work.
Why don't I read this part that was actually highlighted in the PDF? That way people who are listening will have like a better sense of what we're talking about. Because I have a lot of questions just about this. These like 3 sentences.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be really cool, because it's pretty diffuse material, That would be really cool. But I mean, there is a distinction between caloric and ether, but maybe we could get into that when we...
Basically, what's at stake here is the nature of the universe, right? So matter, space, and time, and everything besides. So here's the paragraph that was, and actually there's a piece missing. Like it's almost like an incomplete text. One of the highlights in my text like completely blocks out on page 23. Do you see that part? Like it completely blocks out like what's written there. And I don't know if the secret to the universe is in erasure there, but regardless, I will read this section. Here it is. It says, "This matter, at times called ether, at others caloric, is not itself strictly an object of experience, but its condition." And we'll probably have to go back and talk about that a bit more. "It fills the entire universe, thus forming the condition for space, and with its perpetual oscillation also of time. The principle of replete matter that underlies space and time is close to the pneuma of Stoic physics. So that's something else that we'd probably have to unpack a little bit.
Yeah.
Which, like Kant's version, fills the universe and is manifest dynamically in tonike kinesis. That's the bit that we're kind of working with. So maybe we can begin to unpack that there. Well, first of all, what is the difference between these notions of caloric and ether?
Yeah, so to begin with, Kant does think in terms of caloric, which in the German is Wärmestoff, which is like heat material. So he thinks of it in terms of heat. He'll say things like, we've got this heat material, but its operation is not only heat. It sort of is more, it covers more than that. And then he starts to sort of interchange it with ether, which becomes this more generalized sort of concept. So there are differences, but he does in the end sort of use them as this text says, sort of interchangeably, often in the end, and that it's a sort of condition of possibility as well. So this is a really important aspect of ether, because it becomes the new site of what Kant thinks of as the transcendental. So it becomes the condition of possibility for experience itself.
I'm imagining, reading either as a layperson or somebody new to philosophy and understanding that Kant is infusing these words caloric and ether with philosophical weight. So when I think of ether, I think of space, right? And what Kant seems to be saying is that the existence of the caloric, this sort of either manifold singularity from which all definite objects of the universe come from. One of the words that he uses, there's various textures, right?
Yeah.
That somehow this play of forces in the universe brings about various textures of the caloric. And the ether, now the question that remains for me is this the space of which the caloric occupies? Is it this coming into being, or just the brute being of the caloric itself allows for this space to exist? I mean, there's a whole cosmological question here.
Really, really good. Yeah, that's a really brilliantly picked up on, in my opinion, because ether is spoken about a lot in a cosmological sort of tone by Kant, and right. I mean, and it does hit upon this question of is Kant talking about a sort of matter that fills space, or is he talking about something else? Is it a different sort of? Do we have to think about it differently? And in my opinion, it comes to the fore more as a sort of negative condition of possibility. Yeah. So he'll always say things like it's the condition of possibility for the weighability, the weight of matter, right? But it's not itself weighable, or it's the condition of possibility for the coercion or the movement of matter, but it itself doesn't move and can't be coerced. So you always get this sort of negative definition of it, and that sort of reflects its intermediary status between being a concept and a material. So it's not fully either, really. It plays again into this sort of transition concept that it's sort of in both in a way. And it's interesting that as a condition of possibility, this sort of goes back to what you were asking as well, Adam, where how are objects possible out of this? And it's through this sort of oscillation that you get different configurations, different tensities of force that sort of bundle up, to make an object essentially. And again, this is a sort of some interpreters of this consider it as the point at which Kant turns the transcendental into a material. So they will say that the ether is a material condition of possibility for experience, and then others will say no, this isn't a material. That it's something a bit more difficult to pin down. I mean, I think it's a bit more difficult to pin down personally. It's not strictly a matter, but it's not strictly a concept. So you're sort of working in this liminal sort of zone.
I mean, there's that tension, isn't there, of Kant says in the critique, saying we have these conditions, this base programming that allows us to receive objects and know them according to natural laws, and we can't know anything about anything further than that. It's like, well, this programming has being. We get these. There is this program really is in us. That's a brute fact, and Kant acknowledges it. And Meillassoux does this. He takes this brute factuality and makes it into a whole principle of the absolute. I think Kant might be doing something similar because So if this transcendental really exists, what is it made out of? It's made of the same. If objects made of matter, and we have essentially a programmed object, a coded object, almost a virtual object, in the very idea of a possible object, the very possibility of object itself must have a material that spans the entire universe of objects. And it does take this tension of if we do really have these transcendental programmings, we really have these objects, then why can't we talk about the being of them? I mean, if this power is sort of already within us, I mean, why has it always been in God? Why is it always cut off? And I think Kant is now finally sort of in this text, he goes, well, actually, you don't need to cut it off. Okay, then we've already know that these conditions of possibility, we have to, if we assume them to be real, okay, then we can ask, okay, what are the conditions of possibility for this programming? So we need this virtual layer. And I wonder sometimes, it reminds me of this very short essay by Deleuze. It's the last essay I think he ever wrote before he died. It was A Life, Immanence. Yeah. And he talks about there's this pure immanence at the bottom of things, pure life, pure vitality, and how it sort of creates objects or becomes individuated as a life is it's almost like propelled, he says, infinite speed through a transcendental field. It's almost the instant sort of the pure intensity of force propels itself through this matrix, through this virtual matrix, and ends up going through, I mean, stuff like us. It goes through stuff like us. And we're a particular sort of construction of these forces, isolated at a particular moment in this sort of virtual web of caloric or ether. And then just that for us produces experience. I mean, this is a problem. I mean, one of the problems with this is it's so anthropocentric, but from a perspective of a natural science, it's not a bad way of going about it. It's like Spinoza, but it's a bit more, rather than simply doing an axiomatic. It starts with an axiomatic, and then to make it even more like what Kant inserts more Deleuzian than Deleuze is a Spinozist here, because these transcendentals that brought to this point of explosion where it sort of diffuses itself across the entire universe. It's a really fascinating way of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting. I mean, and that as well is reflected in this part where this text brings up Pneuma, which is a Stoic concept meaning sort of life-giving air or sort of life force, really. And it is like that for Kant. Exactly as you were saying, Adam, and how that fits into Kant's previous work is sort of dependent on how you read his previous work, whether or not there is actually a space for that, or whether we need to look elsewhere, to something like Deleuze and this sort of concept. And it is very interesting. It's got a lot as well to do with tone and tonus, and that was something connected with the Pneuma of Stoic physics, where you consider the cosmos as this sort of universal instrument, and there are these different sort of songs or different tones that sort of play, strings that get sort of plucked. And Kant thinks of it he experiments with that sort of a way of thinking about it too, that it's thinking about it as degrees of tone or degrees of tension that sort of express like particular localizations, of this oscillation. And then you've also got the sort of life element of it. I mean, Kant in Opus Postumum sort of goes back to thinking organism and life, which he did in the third critique, but he sort of goes back to it in Opus Postumum in a perhaps more constitutive way, which is very different from what he was doing in the third critique, where you can really only think of organism as this sort of regulative function. You can't tell whether the organism is operating according to mechanical law or whether it's operating according to teleological sort of dynamical law, and he picks that up again and he starts to talk about it a lot more constitutively. So that sort of plays into that the fact that this is sort of like a pneuma, like a life-giving air,
Adam kind of took the words right out of my mouth by referencing one of my favorite essays, which is fine. But I should also say I almost don't know what else to add to this, except to say that, there's an interesting idea here with Pneuma. Like if we were to think of, and I don't want to bring in too much of quantum physics, especially since I'm so far away from it right now, but if we were to think of the universe as a kind of singular quantum fabric, that if the whole thing was a life, as Deleuze said, and each one of these iterations of things that we understand as objects are just localizations of tension, quote unquote organisms. One of the things that we have to bring into our definition of organism is the idea that organisms break down. There's always a kind of sloughing off, lines of flight, that our notion of organism does not maintain the kind of solidity. No object does, in view of the sort of vast and pervasive singularity that underlies everything. And I like the idea of Pneuma. It kind of connects back to something that Adam had said in a previous episode. I mean, Pneuma is essentially air, right?
Exactly.
It's like almost like an oxygen, the oxygen for being in some sense, where you have, the tensions, the play of tensions on this sort of univocal field of air, is allowed in virtue of the affirmation of these tensions in this field. Like, I know I'm kind of slopping a lot of it together here, but there's definitely this connection between the notion of ether and Pneuma as a kind of air and the caloric as a sort of localization of the theory of forces, or the other forces within the universe.
Just to clarify on the oxygen point, so Craig is referencing a little point I made about with Todd McGowan about sort of contradiction and tension at the heart of being, and basically the idea that contradiction or fundamental tension is like oxygen in sort of the original principle sense. I mean, oxygen means like acid generating, like acidic in its original terms, but also in the same way that oxygen is what sustains life, but also oxidization is the greatest hostility to life. So life is its own tension. And this shows up kind of like in Schelling later, because Schelling has a principle of oxygen which makes no sense unless you start thinking of oxygen as fundamentally acidic rather than this vital. See, ideology has really ruined thinking about oxygen. So you think it's just this life-giving thing, and ultimately they still say antioxidants, but they don't let you make the connection between antioxidants and oxidization. It's very naughty. But
you see, that's a very interesting part of this. That I mean, in the end, really, like it's sort of, it's difficult to get a theory of decay out of Kant's concept of the ether, because it's a sort of reinstantiation of the permanent. So you get temporary you get temporary sort of tensions out of that sort of arise and break down. But the ether itself, it seems to be this sort of permanence for Kant. So you get this sort of, which is very strange, to think of it in that way, that it's sort of always is the case. It's never not, which sort of again lends itself to this idea that Kant is really thinking the absolute here. He's thinking this sort of unconditioned that is the source of conditions, but it itself is just always remaining unconditioned, always remaining absolute. So it's a very interesting result, and it comes out as well in his in the way that he uses it in a sort of cosmological setting, where you have to sort of infer that what Kant is saying is that the cosmos is sort of permanent, like it itself is a permanent feature that never decays properly. It kind of decays in a localized way, but it never properly goes away. It never properly dies. So, and you get that sort of even links it to people like Schelling and Hegel, even, to think the absolute in that way.
I wanted to push Kant's notion of the idea of consciousness being one consciousness.
Yeah.
We don't get to see the full picture here in Caigill's paper, but I think bringing in Deleuze's notion of the singularity, or the singular subject, as Joe Hughes puts it in his work on difference and repetition, or the transcendental subject, if you will, it seems that a similar concept is at play here, that there needs to be a way, however, to negotiate, once again, between particular instances of experience or consciousness with the one experience. And let me just correct myself. I didn't mean a singular consciousness. I meant a singular experience. That's what Caygill says here. But we might not be that different in terms of what we're talking about. And I think it's interesting to note, to go back to Deleuze's essay, A Life, these sort of examples that Deleuze marshals in elaborating his concept of a life involve kind of a moral care. And I'm not sure if you looked at this essay recently, but he talks about that one Charles Dickens story about the dying man. There was this man in town who was a scoundrel. Nobody liked him, and he suffered some kind of heart attack or something. And I probably have the details of the story wrong. But what happens in this instance, and perhaps this is relatable in some way, even if somebody whom you have some negative regard or negative sentiments towards, if they experience a heart attack, you're like, oh my gosh, let me help you. And suddenly the community pulls around this person and they try to help in the moment of crisis. And it's like, in an instant, all the sort of bullshit, superficial resentments fall away, and come together in these like sort of eruptions, these moments of care. And I mean, there's kind of an irony here, because in as much as Deleuze critiques Kant's concept of moral law, there is this synergy between the notion of a universalizing in the local, as if a kind of collective or assembled care occurs in the moment of crisis with people gathering around the dying person or what have you. But I'm wondering, where in Kant's work is there something that we don't see here that maybe we'll find in the Opus that point to something similar? Like, is Kant making a connection between this one experience and the particular experience? Like, how does the particular experience connect with the one?
He says quite a lot that there's sort of only one experience, basically. There's only one experience, but when you talk about experiences as a plural, you're actually just talking about different perceptions. You're not talking about different experiences. So there is this sort of univocity at work there, where there's one experience and just different sort of modalities of that experience, or different expressions of it, to put it in a sort of Deleuzian, Spinozist sort of frame. Like, there are different expressions of the one thing. So and it's really related to this need to unify. And to go back to what you were saying at first about self-consciousness, that really is in evidence there, because that's the site where Kant wants to think the unity of the subject and the object, essentially. And he does it by making a sort of post-Kantian move against himself. He doesn't try to enact a unity between the intuition and the concept as he does in the deductions, by going back to a unity of like self-consciousness. He just says that self-consciousness is identical to the act by which you posit yourself as an object. There's no difference. If you are self-conscious, you are an object. So it's sort of, he's enacting that unity without going through the same procedures that he did in the deductions, and he does it through this sort of post-Kantian lens. And so you end up with this sort of unified subject object. It plays into like most of what he does sort of after that point, which is that's quite a late moment in the Opus. That's a more sort of towards 1800, 1801 sort of moment. So fascicle 7 and fascicle 1, those are the last sort of bits that he wrote. And I mean, there's a really interesting quote that he sort of reflects this, and how it also maps on to what you were saying about about how what we're talking about with the ether. Kant says in a reflection, he says that the container is simultaneously the content. So it's like the container which contains itself as content. And it is really a sort of extrapolation of thinking in those terms that he's trying to do. And, you can see the parallels with someone like Deleuze, with trying to do that. It's almost got a similar spirit, to it.
when the container is the content and the content's experience, it's almost like this substance is, I don't know how to say it, I mean, subject to itself in some kind of way. This substance is somehow subject in some kind of way. I don't know. I mean, I know Hegel says substance subject. I mean, but I just talked about Fascicle 7. I gave it a brief read before we started, and the self-positing thing really does like take Kant out of himself. This is like the ecstasy of Kant, because I mean, in Kant's transcendental deductions in the first critique, there is a self, and you can get like a sense of yourself a little bit, but it's never fully linked up. It's like, it's not like an I am I. It's more like I am, I guess. I get this sense of myself in time, but this self isn't the same thing that's unifying all my experiences. It's just a latent possibility that if I think something, the words I think can accompany it. It can be in me, or in my consciousness, or in my cognition.
Yeah.
But what I quite like about St. Fascicle is, and it sort of leads on to a wider question of mine about his sort of own revolution inside his ontology. And this one actually is a bloody Copernican revolution. It took him God knows how many years. But this one is the final
It's a really, really good point. Yeah. But, I mean, this is sort of, you can read this as what the critical philosophy sort of should have been.
Should have bloody been. The fulfillment, the abolition and fulfillment. It's like a very St. Paul kind of thing. But the question I had, I guess, was he talks about a lot of these scraps. He says, literally in the margins, he talks about God, and particularly God not as something you can prove directly in terms of God's existence, but in a manner of practical reason. But the way he starts talking about God seems to be as if God is like it's kind of the self-conscious efficacy of moral thought. It's almost like the capacity of autonomy, something that has to be imagined as someone else, but ultimately is the kind of thing that has to be brought down to the individual level in order to be an effective force in the universe. And I quite like this, because the problem with Kantian morality, and Hegel brings this up brilliantly in the Phenomenology of Spirit, among other places, is that there's a fundamental disregard for the world. It doesn't matter what the world says. If you formulate the maxim and if it fits the actual transcendental structure of morality, you act as if all the things you're going to need to presuppose are there: God, freedom, and immortality, and then you go do it. It doesn't really matter what the world's like. Whereas here, it seems like the world, one accepts that God is a principle that allows oneself to be compelled. It allows one to participate in the force of moral legislation. It's almost like one participates in God's autonomy, and that makes moral practical reason an active power in the world. But I'm wondering how this fits into the wider ontology here, because it seems like if you put this univocal aspect of being into Kant, I mean, I always explain univocity of being as being speaks with one voice in everything, but at different volumes every part. And in this sense, is there a flattening of the Kantian ontology here? Does it destabilize its own hierarchy? Or does this notion of God, insofar as it still is a hierarchical being, because God doesn't have, people have duties for Kant. God doesn't. God just has rights. We have rights and duties. God has no duties at all. If anything, he gives duties to us, and that's why he's so necessary for Kant. But so some question, I guess, is what does Kant's sort of reconfiguration of God mean for the active potentials of humans in the world to enact force in their everyday lives, socially and individually? And also, what does this mean in terms of the hierarchy of Kantian thought? Is there a flattening?
Yeah. I mean, so you're referring to the very last part, right, of Opus Postumum, which is fascicle 1, weirdly enough. So even the way that they're numbered is sort of askew, you know. So fascicle number 1.
Shit, I've been reading wrong one.
Yeah. I mean, so you have like fascicle 7 comes in sort of 1800, 1801, and then fascicle 1 comes in 1801. So and then it's kind of stretched out to sort of 1803. But it's the last kind of part, and he starts to think a lot about God and about the world. But I think it's important to remember that he's not thinking God as a sort of deity or or as a theism in any traditional way. He thinks of God as a totality. So God is an expression of a particular way of sort of thinking totality. So, and that totality will be what he calls the being of all being. So he thinks of God as the being of all being, but then opposed to that, you have his concept of the world, which is the being of all beings, plural. So, and it's the human being that sort of connects those two. At the very end, he starts to write what seems to be a brand new project, the very end of his life. He gives a title to it. He says it's the highest standpoint of transcendental philosophy in the system of the two ideas, God, the world, and the subject, which connects both objects. So it's like the human being becomes the incarnation of two types of totality, becomes the realization of two different totalities. And I mean, whether that's a flattening of the ontology, I'm not sure. I don't know, but
yeah, it's definitely not. And I think about it in that sense, no.
Well, maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But it's definitely a weird way of thinking about sort of God and the world and how they interact, because what he's essentially saying is that every human being is an incarnation of God and world. And that's essentially like saying every human being is Christ. I mean, that's what he's sort of pointing at. And
so he is Hegel.
Well, he's
or Spinoza.
No, sorry.
I mean, he mentions Spinoza in this text as well. I mean, he kind of notes Spinoza's name down, which is sort of rare for Kant, and he aligns him with the past incarnation or the past expression of transcendental philosophy, you know. And then he says like Spinoza, Schelling, Lichtenberg, the past, present, future of transcendental idealism. So, I mean, he is thinking in those terms of you know, people like Spinoza. Surely he must be.
It's still so weird that Schelling is the present. I mean, I know Schelling had written the system of transcendental idealism about that time, but it starts with the self producing itself as it starts with this self-positing and where to go from there. And I'm like, come on, I mean, Kant, surely you wrote this the wrong way around. Lichtenberg was in his like 60s or something. I mean, he was an Anglophile. He couldn't have been that right about anything. I mean,
yeah, exactly. No, yeah, he had a profound respect for Lichtenberg. And Lichtenberg had a profound respect for Kant. And interestingly, like Lichtenberg proposes this way of thinking nature that Kant, I think, really embodies in Opus Postumum especially, which is that for Lichtenberg, you can only sort of take out of nature what it is that you put into it. You can only, you know, you posit the laws of nature, essentially. And Kant sort of runs with that in the first critique, but the consequences of it aren't really borne out. They're not really, I mean, they sort of are, but they're not fully extrapolated, and you get a sort of vacillation between two different angles that Kant wants to sort of synthesize. But in Opus Postumum, he seems to kind of let go and sort of says, okay, yeah, you know, we if we take this seriously, that we only get out of nature what it is that we posit, then it sort of makes sense with self-positing. It sort of goes hand in hand with that you have to first of all posit yourself as an object in order to have any sort of experience of laws of nature. And yeah, and that's a very Schellingian moment, because when he's talking about that, that's actually after the publication of Schelling's system of transcendental idealism. So Kant is writing after that, and you know, it's a Schellingian moment from Kant, really.
I guess we're sort of coming towards the end of time. The end of time, yes, we're coming towards the end of time. So we're coming towards time, I guess. And I think one question I wanted to ask in sort of a totalizing moment here is almost like is this the absolute end of Kant's critical project? If Kant got this where it was, or has transcendence been transcended, or is this just like is this fulfillment of it? I mean, is this? Because a lot of Kant scholars seem to have repressed this and invoke some ableist nonsense about dementia or something like that. But
well, is
there a future for this text? Do you think where we could sort of reinvigorate Kant beyond Kant, not simply to subsume him as a Deleuzean or as a as a Hegelian or as a Schellingian, as much as it's very tempting and may even be right to do so. But it's just this sort of open up, and can you write? Catherine wrote The Future of Hegel.
Yeah.
Have you just written The Future of Kant?
Well, that is actually one of the questions that I started out with. What is the future of Opus Postumum? And I mean, I think in a broad sort of sense, like what it does is it doesn't sort of transgress totally the critical work. I mean, there are moments that do, but then there are moments that don't, that sort of stay within it too. But I think as a whole, if we can consider it as a whole, far from like the way that it was sort of received to begin with, which was that this was nonsense and Kant had lost his mind, and he didn't really know what he was talking about at this point. He was, he'd lost all of his senses and all of this sort of stuff. Like that's an interpretation that's definitely buried now. I mean, no one really takes that seriously now in the scholarship, thankfully. But so from a broad kind of view, what it does is it challenges our concept of how we think of Kant and how we read Kant. So the typical way of reading Kant is that he's this guy who, everybody sets their clocks to. He's this mechanical, formulaic, kind of systematic thinker. But what Opus Postumum does is it allows us an interruption into that process to show us not the final product, but the actual process by which it's in motion. And so it calls on us to sort of engage not with Kant's philosophy, but with his philosophizing. So it calls on us to do our own philosophizing alongside Kant. And I think that's the major, maybe not revolution, but sort of overcoming maybe of that image of the critical Kant, being this mechanical thinker, to one which he's not. He's a dynamical thinker. He's always changing and vacillating and moving and, transitioning between very different points. And, you don't really read Opus Postumum as much as sort of deal with it and live with it and think with it, So I think that's the sort of hopefully the future of Opus Postumum.
It makes me think about that line from Deleuze, where we are forced to think by forces from the outside. And it seems like, in my very limited reading of Critique of Pure Reason, I mean, I understand that one of the primary precepts that Kant is using is that he's using the principles of reason to critique the very principles, the founding principles itself. And it stands to reason that what he's doing here is an ultimate consequence of that to think in terms of distinction and concept, that it's going to create its own internal tensions within the system that will ultimately be ruptured. And one of the ways that I see that, just as, an amateur philosopher, is that there's an incredible freedom in that, in the sense that you get to maintain, in the violence of thought, I believe sometimes there's a bliss because there's a release and it allows us to think differently. What I can see through the window of Howard's paper here is that possibility, or that eventuality in Kant's thought, is realized by him attempting to think transition backwards. And I don't know, to me, that's really exciting. And also it takes a lot of humility, and it takes a lot of moral courage, in a sense, as a philosopher, to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love your line about the violence of thought, by the way. I'm sort of wishing that I called my whole thesis that now.
There's time. You don't have the doctorate yet. You go back and change it now.
Maybe I should change it, because it really is. It is a sort of violence. But the violence is all on us, like we instigate, or maybe not the violence on us, but we instigate the violence, by interrupting this process, by sort of interjecting this flow. We sort of I mean, Kant often described it as a pain, when he's writing these fascicles. He says this is like a pain, to kind of think this through. But it's very exciting, and there is a freedom to it. There's a freeing up, a looseness that sort of comes about from it. And I've sort of become more and more inclined to think as well that this was just Kant's process of thinking, like with all of his work. You know, like I think that this is how he constructed his text. He thinks through writing, you know, and all of, if we would have got all of the drafts from all of his previous texts, they would probably look something like this. That it's just that the exception is that we get the final product, whereas here we don't. So, which is sort of a, you know, we get the productivity, you know, the action. So, and it's really exciting. Yeah, it's a very exciting thing to do, but it's very difficult too. And I mean, to get a handle on it is a tough thing.
Say yes to conceptual violence.
Yeah.
and you know, it makes me think, just a very brief polemic here against some British podcasters. You know, recently on the timeline, I had seen, and I won't say their name, but you know, the whole issue of people being forced to think about the ontology of gender. Oh, and this is somebody who positions themselves as a thinker. I think the task of the philosopher is, you know, if there is one sort of violence that we must say yes to, it is this conceptual violence.
Yeah.
You know, this is what allows us to think the new. And I think it creates the conditions for new kinds of freedom.
To think for yourself, you know, this is Kant's sort of dictum, like think for yourself, learn to think for you know, learn to kind of employ your own understanding, you know, and to be in the act of thinking. And to not allow that to get too frozen over with thought, you know, to allow yourself to be suspended in the thinking. And yeah, and it sort of does, it challenges us to sort of rethink, to be allowed to rethink certain premises that we hold, to sort of change our opinion, to change our mind. And Kant's corpus is nothing more than really a continual changing of mind. You know, and I think that's often lost, you know. But
the violence is always a point of rupturing rather than smothering. We're not saying conceptual violence is you go smother other concepts, but if you can bring out what's hidden in them, that little sort of point of contradiction, tension, differentiation, you can usually explode them that way. And I think both, I mean, Kant in this text does it to himself, Deleuze does it, Hegel does it, Bataille does it. It's conceptual violence is always a productive encounter because it essentially just lets out what's already in there ultimately. And I think Kant did change. Kant just to clear it off at the end, Kant did have his bad moments. I mean, Kantian anthropology was a very scientific racist endeavor, and that's not. And as much as he may have regretted it later in life, we're still within consequences of that. But I do think in terms of the spirit of Kantian philosophizing, you can bring these things to rupture. You can really do them some damage in the most productive and even emancipatory way from thought possible. And I think that is the way we can. Kant was both learning and being better than himself in the ways that we can learn from Kant and be better than Kant in a very Kantian or even post-Kantian manner, because the post-Kant, as we've seen from today, is already in Kant himself.
Exactly, yeah.
If we conceive of the violence as rupture, there's a kind of joy there. If it's a kind of smothering, it's impotence.
To think the rupture, I think that would be definitely a sort of programmatic way into this text. If we can call it a text, because it is a sort of series of ruptures or a series of invitations to rupture. And I mean, Kant is always as well. I mean, he's stating, restating, you know, deleting, crossing things out, putting them back in. I mean, often the things that he deletes are sort of the most interesting, the things that you really kind of value. But you know, the marginalia that runs along all of these in this manuscript. I mean, it really is a process of continually challenging yourself, you know, and your premises. And Kant was pretty fearless at going back and just sort of changing things, you know.
He was his own sort of Robespierre, the terror of philosophy.
Yeah, yeah.
And he cuts off his own head in the end.
Yeah, yeah.
Just like this is,
yeah. I mean, how much can we consider? I mean, this is the question that I've sort of been getting to a little bit more recently, which is like, how far can we take this idea that Kant moves towards post-Kantianism? what does that mean for the trajectory of German idealism, which is usually considered as a sort of, after Fichte, as a sort of reaction against Kant, especially in someone like Schelling. But then you come across this and you can say, okay, but is it really what Kant are we talking about? Because here he seems to be pretty in harmony with a lot of those ideas. So was he moving towards a post-Kantian position? Was he instigating the critical work sort of downfall? I mean,
so I guess as a final sort of remark, or sort of almost close, maybe if we caveat, are we have for time?
No, close it out, man. Do it.
All right, okay. This is a final question. So, is the Opus Postumum the real oldest systematic program of German idealism? Because it's older than the other one.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean, it's a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, well, maybe, because German idealism is born out of Kant anyway. It does arise out of his thinking. So that he sort of moves towards a position which could be seen as post-Kantian, you could say that he's picking up on his own anticipation of early German idealism. And in that sense, you could say it sort of is an inevitable result that you would end up with something very similar to something that Schelling and Hegel did.